Frank Delano had been a John Deere man his entire farming life. He was 56 years old. He farmed 800 acres of wheat and corn outside of Hastings, Nebraska, and he had never owned a tractor that wasn't green. This was not something he was quiet about. Frank talked about John Deere equipment the way some men talked about their faith, with conviction, with certainty, with a willingness to engage anyone who disagreed. At the co-op in Hastings, at the feed store, at the elevator, Frank was the man who could tell you why the John Deere 8R series was the finest production tractor built in the last 20 years, why the IVT transmission was superior to any CVT on the market, and why any farmer who chose a different brand was either uninformed or stubborn or both. Frank's neighbors had heard these arguments many times. Some of them agreed. Some of them used other brands and said nothing, because arguing with Frank about tractors was a conversation that had no end. Frank's wife, Linda, had told him more than once that his feelings about John Deere were more intense than his feelings about most people. Frank had not disagreed with that assessment. Frank's 2022 John Deere 8R.370 was the crown jewel of his operation. 370 horsepower, infinitely variable transmission, command arm controls, JD-Link telematics. He had paid $422,000 for it new, and he believed every dollar was justified. The machine was powerful, precise, and reliable. Frank could pull a 60-foot toolbar through heavy clay without the engine ever breaking a sweat. He could set a GPS line and walk away from the wheel for a mile. He could monitor the machine from his phone sitting at the kitchen table. It was, in Frank's estimation, the best piece of equipment he had ever owned, and he was happy to tell anyone who would listen exactly why. He had told the story of buying it to everyone at the co-op 3 times in the first month. By spring of 2023, most people in Adams County had heard about Frank's 8R370, whether they wanted to or not. Cole Hensley moved into the farm adjacent to Frank's property in March 2023. The property had been empty for 2 years after the previous owner had retired and moved to Arizona. Cole was 42 years old, originally from Iowa, and he had bought the 640 acres outright with cash from the sale of his Iowa operation. He arrived with a fleet of equipment on flatbed trailers. Frank drove to the fence line to watch. He counted the machines as they came off the trailers: a planter, a disc, a grain cart, 2 semis, and a tractor, a red tractor, a Massey Ferguson 8S.305. Frank stood at the fence line and looked at it. 305 horsepower, less than his 8R370 on paper. He watched Cole back it off the trailer and drive it to the shed. Frank drove home and looked up the specs on his laptop. He read the Massey Ferguson 8S literature. He read comparison reviews. He found one review that suggested the 8S305 performed well above its rated horsepower in field conditions due to the engine management system. Frank dismissed this as manufacturer marketing. He had a 370 horsepower John Deere. No 305 horsepower Massey Ferguson was going to keep up with it. Frank met Cole for the first time at the co-op in April. Cole was buying seed and fertilizer. Frank introduced himself. Cole was friendly, quiet, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. Frank asked about the Massey Ferguson. Cole said it was a good machine. Frank said he had heard mixed things about the 8S series. Cole asked what he had heard. Frank said he had read that the CVT had issues under sustained heavy load. Cole said he hadn't experienced that. Frank said maybe he hadn't pushed it hard enough. Cole looked at Frank for a moment. He said the tractor pulled fine for everything he had asked it to do. Frank said maybe it was adequate for Iowa ground, but Nebraska clay was different. Cole said clay was clay. Frank said he would take his 370 horsepower Deere over a 305 horsepower Massey Ferguson in heavy ground any day of the week. Cole said that was his choice to make. He picked up his order and left. Frank stood at the counter and felt vaguely unsatisfied with how the conversation had ended. The argument escalated over the next 6 weeks. Frank found reasons to be at the co-op when Cole was there. He would bring up equipment. He would reference his 8R370. He would mention horsepower ratings and torque curves and fuel efficiency numbers. Cole would respond briefly and without heat. This infuriated Frank more than active disagreement would have. Cole's calm refusal to be baited felt like condescension, like Cole thought Frank wasn't worth arguing with. In May, Frank started making the argument more direct. He said at the co-op counter one morning, loud enough for 6 other farmers to hear, that a man who chose a Massey Ferguson over a John Deere 8R was either paying too much attention to price or not enough attention to performance. Cole was standing 6 feet away. Cole turned and looked at Frank. He said the Massey Ferguson 8S.305 would outpull Frank's 8R 370 in heavy clay ground. Frank said that was the most uninformed statement he had heard in 20 years of farming. Cole said maybe they should find out. Frank said fine by him. Cole said fine by him too. The 6 farmers at the counter went quiet. Someone said this was going to be interesting. They argued about the terms for 2 weeks. Word spread through the county the way words spread in farming communities, quickly and completely. By the time Frank and Cole agreed on the specifics, at least 30 people knew about it. The test would be conducted on a Saturday in late May. They would choose a field with heavy clay soil, the kind that separated real horsepower from rated horsepower. They would pull identical toolbar configurations, 600 pound per foot draft resistance. They would measure ground speed, fuel consumption, and depth consistency over a measured course. 3 neutral observers would document the results. The bet was Frank's idea. He said they needed stakes or it was just a demonstration. Cole said what did Frank have in mind? Frank said spring input costs. Cole asked how much. Frank said his spring inputs for that year were $112,000. Seed, fertilizer, chemicals, custom application. Cole said his were $94,000. Frank said the loser covered the winner's inputs. Cole said that was a significant amount of money. Frank said if you're confident in your equipment, it shouldn't matter. Cole said agreed. Linda found out about the bet on a Thursday evening 2 weeks before the test. She found the written agreement Frank had signed sitting on his desk in the farm office, a 1-page document signed by both men and witnessed by 2 farmers from the co-op. Linda read it twice. Then she came to find Frank in the shop where he was servicing the 8R 370. She put the paper on the workbench in front of him. She said, "What is this?" Frank said it was a gentleman's agreement about a field test. Linda said it was a $112,000 bet on a tractor race. Frank said it wasn't a race. It was a performance comparison. Linda said the distinction did not comfort her. Frank said there was no chance he was going to lose. Linda said he could not know that. Frank said he had a 370 horsepower machine against a 305. The math was clear. Linda said the math was only clear if horsepower was the only variable. Frank said it was the primary variable. Linda said she wanted him to cancel the bet. Frank said he couldn't do that without looking like he had lost his nerve. Linda said she would rather he look like he had lost his nerve than lose $112,000. Frank said he wasn't going to lose. Linda said she was going to pretend she had never seen the paper, and they were never going to discuss it again. She walked out of the shop. Frank picked up the agreement and put it back in his desk drawer. The test was held on a Saturday morning in late May. The field belonged to a farmer named Garrett, who had agreed to let them use his heaviest clay section. 31 people showed up to watch. The 2 John Deere dealers from Adams County were there, both of them quietly hoping Frank would validate their brand. The Massey Ferguson dealer from Grand Island was there, an hour's drive. Cole had called him personally. Frank had not expected that. When Frank saw the Massey Ferguson dealer standing at the field edge with a notebook, he felt the first real twinge of uncertainty. This was no longer just a bet between neighbors. This was a public brand contest with dealer representation on both sides. Frank pushed the feeling down. He had 370 horsepower. Cole had 305. The outcome was determined by physics. They set up identical toolbar configurations. A 60-foot toolbar with the hydraulic pressure set to create equivalent draft resistance across both setups. Garrett and 2 other neutral observers checked and confirmed the configurations were matched. They marked a 500-yard course through the heaviest section of the field, a section with 40% clay content in the top 18 inches. Garrett had farmed this ground for 22 years and said it was the hardest pulling ground in the county. Frank felt good about that. Heavy ground favored raw horsepower. Cole brought the Massey Ferguson 8S305 to the start line. Frank brought the John Deere 8R370. They sat side by side at the field edge. The two machines looked dramatically different. The Deere was bigger, wider, the tires were larger, the engine displacement was greater. Frank sat in the cab and felt the confidence that comes from knowing the numbers. Cole sat in the Massey Ferguson cab and looked straight ahead. They ran the course one at a time. Frank went first. He set his toolbar depth, engaged the draft control, and pulled into the field. The 8R370 moved through the clay smoothly. The engine management system adjusted fuel delivery under load. The IVT held ground speed precisely. Frank watched his monitor. Ground speed, 5.8 miles per hour at a consistent depth of 8 inches through the full 500 yards. Fuel consumption was logged. Frank came off the field at the far end and turned around. He felt good. That was a strong run. The 8R had not bogged once. Consistent depth, consistent speed. He drove back to the start line and climbed out. The observers recorded his numbers. The John Deere dealer from Hastings patted Frank on the shoulder and said that was impressive. Frank nodded. Cole pulled the Massey Ferguson to the start line. He set the depth. He engaged the hydraulics. He pulled into the field. Frank watched from the fence line with his arms crossed. The Massey Ferguson looked smaller, pulling the same toolbar. 305 horsepower versus 370. This was where the difference would show. Cole moved into the heavy clay. Frank watched the speed. He expected to see it drop. The clay would load the toolbar. The Massey Ferguson would labor. The numbers would show what Frank already knew. But the numbers did not show what Frank already knew. Cole held 5.9 miles per hour for the first 100 yards, then 6.1. The Massey Ferguson was moving faster than Frank's Deere through the same ground. Frank uncrossed his arms. He watched the monitor visible through Cole's cab window from a distance. Consistent depth, consistent speed. The engine management on the 8S was doing something with fuel delivery under load that the rated horsepower didn't reflect. The machine was producing more effective drawbar pull than its displacement suggested. Cole came off the field at 500 yards. The observers checked their stopwatches and recording devices. The Massey Ferguson had run the course at a higher average ground speed and at consistent depth throughout. Fuel consumption per acre was logged. The results were calculated. Cole's Massey Ferguson 8S.305 had outpulled Frank's John Deere 8R .370 in Adams County clay by a measurable margin across every metric. Ground speed, depth consistency, fuel efficiency under load. Frank stood at the fence and stared at the field. The Massey Ferguson dealer from Grand Island was smiling. The John Deere dealers from Adams County were not smiling. The 30 farmers who had come to watch were talking quietly among themselves. Frank stood very still for a long time. Then he said the test was rigged. He said the toolbar configurations hadn't been identical. He said Cole's draft resistance setting was different from his. Garrett walked over and showed Frank the documentation. He showed him the hydraulic pressure readings. He showed him the toolbar weight calculations. Everything was identical. Frank said the soil conditions weren't consistent across the course. Garrett said he had farmed that field for 22 years. It was consistent. Frank said the timing was different. The observers showed him the stopwatch records. Frank ran out of objections. He stood there in silence. Cole walked over from the Massey Ferguson. He said Frank ran a good machine. He said the Deere was a fine tractor. He said in different conditions the result might be different. He wasn't gloating. He was being straightforward. Frank looked at him and said he wanted a rematch. Cole said the terms of the agreement didn't include a rematch. Frank said he was asking for one. Cole said no. He said the test had been fair and documented. He said he expected Frank to honor the terms. Frank said he needed time. Cole said he had 30 days per the agreement. Frank said 30 days wasn't enough time to arrange $112,000. Cole said that was Frank's problem to solve. Frank drove home and sat in his truck in the driveway for 40 minutes. Linda came out eventually and stood by the driver's window. She asked how it went. Frank looked at her. She could see it in his face. She said nothing. She went back inside. Frank came in eventually and told her the result. Linda didn't say, "I told you so." She was quiet for a while. Then she asked how they were going to pay it. Frank said he was working on it. The farm had an operating line of credit with First National Bank in Hastings. The credit line was secured by the farm and the equipment. The available balance was $83,000. That left $29,000 still needed. Frank called his bank the next morning. His loan officer, a man named Warren, asked what the money was for. Frank said it was a debt settlement. Warren asked for details. Frank explained. There was a silence on Warren's end of the line. Warren said he could advance the $83,000 against the operating line. He said it would use the full available balance. Frank said he understood. Warren said that left no cushion for the operating year. Frank said he understood that too. Warren said he hoped the harvest went well. Frank said so did he. Frank paid Cole in 2 installments, $83,000 from the credit line and $29,000 from the farm's cash reserves. It took everything he had available. The payment was made on June 22, 2023, 28 days after the test. Cole acknowledged it, and that was the last direct conversation between the two men for several months. Frank went back to farming. He planted, he sprayed, he managed the operation with no operating cushion and no reserves. He needed a strong harvest to recover. The harvest that fall was not strong. It was not a disaster, but it was below average. Wheat yields came in at 42 bushels per acre against Frank's budget of 51. Corn came in at 178 against a budget of 212. The price environment didn't help. Wheat prices had softened in late summer. Corn prices were lower than projections. Frank's total revenue for the 2023 crop year came in at $408,000 against projected expenses of $391,000. His margin before debt service was $17,000. His annual debt service on the farm mortgage was $76,000. He was $59,000 short. He had no operating reserve to draw on. He had used it to pay the bet. He went to the bank in November. Warren reviewed the numbers. Warren said the farm was in a very difficult position. He said the operating line had been drawn to its limit in June, which he had noted with concern at the time. He said the shortfall in harvest revenue had eliminated any ability to service the operating debt. Frank asked what options he had. Warren said he could seek additional financing, but the farm's debt load was already at the limit of what the collateral could support. The equipment was heavily financed. The land value had not appreciated enough to provide additional borrowing room. Warren said Frank needed to either find significant additional revenue or begin discussing restructuring options. Frank asked what restructuring meant in this context. Warren said it meant working with the bank to find a path that might involve reducing the operation's scale or, in more severe scenarios, liquidating assets to reduce debt. Frank said he was not liquidating anything. Warren said he hoped that wouldn't be necessary, but the numbers needed to improve significantly in 2024. Frank planted in the spring of 2024 with a reduced input budget. He cut seed costs. He reduced fertilizer rates below optimal. He deferred equipment maintenance. He managed every dollar with the knowledge that he had no margin for error. Cole planted next door with his usual inputs. Cole's Massey Ferguson could be heard across the fence line on planting days, running smoothly, the sound of a well-maintained operation with no financial pressure. Frank heard it and said nothing. Linda heard it and also said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The summer of 2024 was hot and dry in Adams County, drier than average. The reduced fertilizer rates Frank had used in the spring showed in the crop. The corn was shorter than normal. The wheat tillered poorly. The stress from the drought hit a crop that was already underfueled. By August, Frank knew the harvest was going to be bad. He called Warren in September before the harvest even started to tell him. Warren said he appreciated the early notice. He said the bank would need to meet with Frank after harvest to discuss the path forward. Frank said he understood. The harvest came in worse than Frank's most pessimistic projection. Wheat at 31 bushels, corn at 144. Revenue came in at $296,000 against expenses of $322,000 before debt service. Frank was $26,000 in the hole before he made a single payment on the mortgage or the operating line. The farm had lost money in an operating year for the first time in Frank's career. Warren called in October. He said the bank needed to have a formal meeting about the farm's financial status. Frank and Linda drove to the bank on a Tuesday morning. Warren had a folder on the table. He went through the numbers carefully and without judgment. Frank's farm had incurred significant debt in the form of the bet payment, which had eliminated operating reserves. 2 consecutive below-average harvests had been unable to recover the shortfall. The farm's debt service coverage ratio had fallen below the bank's required threshold for 2 consecutive periods. The bank's credit committee had reviewed the account. They were requiring a restructuring plan within 60 days. Warren said the options were to bring in additional equity from outside sources, to sell assets sufficient to reduce debt to a serviceable level, or to sell the farm entirely. Frank asked if there was a fourth option. Warren said not within the bank's current framework. Frank said he had been farming that ground for 22 years. Warren said he knew that. Warren said he was sorry. Linda was very still in her chair. Frank sat in his truck in the bank parking lot for a long time after the meeting. Linda sat beside him. She did not say, "I told you so." She had not said it once since the test in May 2023. Frank had given her many opportunities. She had not taken any of them. He thought about that. He thought about the test field in late May, the toolbar configurations, the 500-yard course, the Massey Ferguson moving through the clay at 6.1 miles per hour. He thought about standing at the fence with his arms crossed. He thought about the moment he had run out of objections. He thought about saying the test was rigged when he had known perfectly well it wasn't. He thought about 31 farmers watching, the Massey Ferguson dealers smiling, the John Deere dealers not smiling. He thought about Cole's face when he had walked over afterward, not gloating, just straightforward. He thought about the $112,000 payment, the credit line drawn to zero, the 2 bad harvests, the folder on Warren's table, the 60-day deadline. All of it traced back to a Saturday morning in May when Frank Delano had stood at a co-op counter and told a man he had never met that his tractor was inadequate. And the man had said maybe they should find out, and Frank had said fine. Frank listed the farm in November 2024. He worked with a land broker in Hastings. The asking price was $3,200,000 for the 800 acres, house, and buildings. Equipment would be sold separately. The John Deere 8R370 that Frank had defended with such conviction was listed at auction for $340,000. It sold for $312,000. Cole came to the equipment auction. He didn't bid on anything. He stood at the back of the crowd and watched. After the 8R sold, Cole walked over to Frank. He said he was sorry it had come to this. Frank looked at him. Frank said it hadn't come to this because of the tractor test. Cole waited. Frank said it had come to this because he had made a bet he had no business making, and when he lost it, he had used money the farm needed, and then the weather had done the rest. Cole said the bet had started it. Frank said the bet had been his choice. He said no one had held a gun to his head. Cole said that was a generous way to look at it. Frank said it was the accurate way. He shook Cole's hand. Cole shook back. They stood there for a moment. Then Frank went back to watching the auction. His equipment, his machines, going one by one to other farms. The 8R370 drove off the auction lot on a flatbed trailer, heading south toward a farm in Oklahoma. Frank watched it go. 370 horsepower, the finest production tractor he had ever owned. It had never failed him mechanically. It had never let him down in the field. He had made $112,000 bet on it and lost, not because the machine was inadequate, but because the other machine had been better that day in that ground under those conditions. Frank had spent 30 years believing John Deere was the best. He still believed it was among the best. But he had learned at significant cost that among the best was not the same as always the best. And he had learned that pride, the kind that turns a casual argument at a co-op counter into a 6-figure bet, was the most expensive operating expense a farmer could carry. More expensive than seed, more expensive than fertilizer, more expensive than the finest tractor ever built. Frank and Linda moved off the farm in January 2025. A farming corporation from Iowa bought the land. Frank took a job with an equipment dealership in Hastings, not John Deere, a multi-brand dealer that sold everything. He learned the other brands. He learned their specs and their failure points and their service intervals. He became, by the summer of 2025, one of the most knowledgeable equipment salespeople in Adams County. People came from other counties to ask his opinion. He gave it without bias. He told them the John Deere 8R was an exceptional machine. He told them the Massey Ferguson 8S was also an exceptional machine. He told them the choice depended on their ground conditions, their dealer proximity, their service needs, and their budget. He never told them one was categorically better than the other. Not anymore. He had learned what that kind of certainty cost. He had paid for it in full. $112,000 plus a farm that had been in his family for 22 years. The Massey Ferguson 8S305 is still working on Cole Hensley's farm next door. Cole planted his full input budget in the spring of 2025. His crops looked good. His operation ran quietly and without drama. The way a farm should run. The way Frank's farm had run for 20 years before a conversation at a co-op counter